Flashbacks are high on the do not fly list of screenwriting maneuvers, right next to voiceover, but still below starting your script with an alarm clock going off. Don't do that.
Right to jail, right away.
But the reason these moves are verboten is not because they're inherently bad, but because they're almost always misused as storytelling crutches instead of compelling dramatic moments.
Why?
Because almost universally, the most interesting drama is present tense. It's what's happening right now, in this moment, to the characters we're seeing on screen. But keeping things in the present tense, while dramatically robust, is also very limited. By definition, it's hard, which is why using devices like VO and Flashback to expand on the present moment is so appealing. Maybe your character has something crucial on their mind, and you need the audience to know exactly what. Why not spice things up with some VO giving us direct insight, like in a novel? But this isn't a novel. There are inherent differences between the media, with the ability to get characters' thoughts across directly being one of them. It's why articulating your character's thoughts to the audience is one of the key difficulties of screenwriting.